All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ian Livingston, and today I'm going to talk to you about how we can enable autonomy in our development organizations. So for the last 4 years, I've been working at Salesforce as an architect, managing teams building Node.js applications, backends, platforms, mobile and on mobile with iOS and Android. And I was originally a member of GoInstant, and we were acquired by Salesforce 2 years ago. So today what I really want to talk about is how can we be more productive and build better products. Because the more productive we are, the more we can iterate, the more ideas we can try, which will lead to better products and make us happier, not frustrated, because we're going to be accomplishing something. So to understand how we can build better products, to understand how we can work together better, we need to understand some fundamentals. And that is that building software is a team sport. And what I mean by that is that a product is the emergent result of a team of people working together over a period of time. So that's designers, developers, product managers, operations. It's a summation of all of our conversations, our ideas, the code we write, and our continued thinking, pushing each other the boundaries forward in our discussions with customers. Therefore, when we improve the way we work together, we actually can improve the type of products we build and the quality of products that we build. Because it's not just about one individual and their ability, it's about the ability of the collective. Because at the end of the day, software development is a team sport. It's actually a competitive team sport. And the way we interact, the way we work together has a huge effect. And that's starting to really show in data. And this is a great example from Harvard Business Review. And what it does is it compares manufacturing services firms, and what we work in is services, what we consider services, and that there are companies out there that are miles ahead of the other ones in terms of their productivity, how much things they push out the door. And that productivity measure is also in terms of how many customers they attain, how profitable they are, the success of their customers. That's all included in this productivity measure. And a really great example of this is something most of us use today, is Amazon AWS. Amazon AWS currently owns 40% of the infrastructure as a service space, $8 billion a year in revenue, 36% profit margin. And if you look at the release cadence, if you look at the products they push out, if you look at the quality of product they continuously deliver, you can't compare them to any other cloud provider. If you look at Microsoft and the way that they deliver, you look at even Heroku and Salesforce, the company I work for, you just can't compare. It's incredibly productive. They leverage the moats that they've already built, and they just keep building on top of their own platform and offering tools that enable other people to be productive and deliver incredible experiences. So because we now live in a world where your ability to innovate defines the lifespan of your company, and it's really important to understand how productivity, innovation, how those two work together. And it basically works this way, is that your ability to adapt, your ability to make a change, and how creative you are is what basically determines how innovative you'll be. And so that's why this is so important, of how we work together matters, because it'll help define the type of products we'll build. So in order to understand where we are today and where we got here, we kind of need to look back to the past a bit and understand sort of some of the drastic shifts that have happened in the last 100 years as we've moved, from being a manufacturing, labor-based economy to office knowledge workers, which is what we all are. And one of the big differences is, in the 1920s, you'd have Ford building assembly lines with a Model T, with massive uneducated, untrained people that could be hired in, and all they had to do was pull a lever. Whereas today, we're trying to scale lots of educated people working together, where we're not just simply pulling a lever or writing code. We're trying to figure out solutions to problems. And that's fundamentally different than what we did in the past. But the problem is that a lot of our management techniques and how we work together and what we talk about and how we interact and our the way we think about what management is and how we talk to each other is really based on this factory model. It's based on on what you would assume is what you would have found in a factory in 1920 or 1930s. I mean, our management theory is really out of date. And so when software development was a relatively new field, and so if you look at it, of course we would build on the past, but we have taken a lot of our assumptions of how you would run, a production line to software development. And just as an example, this is sort of like what you would see as an organization chart for a factory. And I will be talking a lot, not a lot, but somewhat about org charts today, and that's probably not the typical developer discussion, but I think this is really important, something we all need to have conversations about, because it fundamentally makes us happier at the end of the day when we actually ship things and those things get used. And this has a huge impact. So if you look at a factory, you'd have a plant manager who generally was highly educated and had a complete understanding of how the entire factory worked. And he could do this because things didn't change very often, right? Like, you'd build the plant, and you generally didn't change it. You would just keep pulling the lever to print out new pencils or to create new toothbrushes or whatever it is. You generally would have a line manager that would report to this plant manager, and that line manager would be responsible for, let's say, the press that, press the pencil out of the wood or however it actually works. And he would be responsible for, or she would be responsible for, the uneducated people, the general employees that would actually pull the lever on the machines. And the more productive they could be is a function of physics, where how many times can I pull a lever on a machine dictates how much productivity I am, like how much I output. And so if you look at the traditional org chart, if you were to go look at any Fortune 500 in the last 10 years, this would be this would look pretty similar. You'd have functional areas that all would roll up to a CTO or a VP of engineering or a CIO or somebody, but they'd all be separated into different functional areas. So you have product managers, release managers, engineers, quality assurance, and technical operations were actually concerned with the bits running in production. And this gave us rise to what we all, I think there's enough evidence to say the waterfall development method, which has been a catastrophic failure in terms of how successful we've been at delivering projects. And it makes a lot of sense because, okay, each functional area gets their sign-off. We now do the design, blah, blah, blah. All right, now it gets built. Okay, now we have to test it. And it follows the org chart. And that's the way we organized ourselves. So it's no wonder things like Dilbert are really popular, because they're really a signal that the way we've been operating is broken. We're not as productive as we should be. In fact, data shows that the average employee, and if you're working in a small services firm, it's a little bit different, but you're working at a company at scale, and lots of companies, technology companies, will be getting scale soon. Just the pure fact of sort of the way the world's changing. Just technology is going to continue to change our lives. We'll continue to have new companies will have to continue to be technologized, build things, blah, blah, blah. So the data shows that the average employee is frustrated and unhappy. And when I think about this, and I go and I do research, and I talk to employees, and I look at my experience, and I talk to other people, and I look at what other people in the space have been doing to try and solve these problems, there's really two issues, right? One is that you have centralized authority, generally, in a single manager who has sign-off on a decision. You have distributed knowledge. So you probably have a person that understands one part of the code base, but not a person that understands another part of the code base, or perhaps you've segmented yourself into different functional areas. You have one person that's responsible for QA, another person responsible for development, another person that's responsible for performance. And that gives you distributed responsibility, and it's spread between different functional roles. And what this actually leads to is meetings to garner alignment, because you have to get all these different people all talking to each other, aligned about what in the world you're actually building. And the problem with that is that generally people have competing agendas, because I'm a QA person. I'm really concerned about, my job description is that I need to ensure that what we produce works. And what ends up happening is that things don't just end up being discussed holistically or objectively, right? You have a lot of people in the room with very competing agendas, and it makes sense why they do, because that's the way we've organized ourselves. And this takes up time as we are sent down one path after another. Have we thought about this? Is this the time to do it? Is this really the priority? And we have lots of those discussions, and those are actually really good discussions. So the problem is the way we have those discussions is really unproductive. Because what we end up doing is we create burnout and apathy, and all of the passion in the employee just sort of dwindles away as it gets beaten out of you by just by the relentless process that's required to maintain this organizational structure. So this brings up a question of, okay, that's great. I somewhat agree with you maybe, or I see these problems, but like, what do we actually do about it? What can we do about it? And there's been a ton of study about how to make people happy and how we can enable them to be engaged and how we can enable people to be successful as knowledge workers. It's in the last 10 years. In an interesting, famous TED Talk we go on by Dan Pink, where he talks about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And so there's some thoughts out there. So let's look at, like, how do we enable, like, what are those three things that we need each individual to have? Like, if you were to have, like, what are the fundamental ideas or fundamental things you need someone to have, enable them to have, so that they can be successful? And it really comes down to is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And autonomy is the ability to be self-directed, so that I come in day after day, and I don't feel like someone's lording over me and saying, hey, you have to go do this. Like, you can't work on this. You have to go over here and do this. And this is really the opposite of the top-down approach of the 20th century, because every day you'd come to the factory and, okay, I know I'm going to pull the press, or I know that I have to design a new machine, but there weren't that many knowledge workers anyways, so they usually were not well organized because they didn't change things so often. And the other thing that we want is mastery, which is we want to feel like we're challenged and that we're always learning. Because if you're not learning, after a while you just get bored of what you're doing. Like if you rewrite the same view code every time, that's just not that interesting after a while, right? So your brain isn't engaged if you're not learning something new. And this is the opposite of the factory floor and other management structures, because generally you'd be doing something repetitive, some repetitive task. And that's okay, because you didn't need to be engaged. You didn't need to be thinking about what you're doing, because everything you're doing was physical, versus now it's all in our brains. It's all how passionate I am. How much have I thought about this? Do I care enough? And those things impact how productive we are, and they impact it because it impacts how happy we are and how fulfilled we are by our job. And finally, purpose, and this one is really important, and this is something I think you've seen. Like, if you were to look at the in the last 10 to 15 years, if you were to look at like software startups, you look at Facebook or at Google, what is the purpose of those companies? Well, Google's purpose is to organize all the world's information. And that's something I can get up in the morning and be like, you know what, that's a good thing. Like, we're actually pushing humanity forward that way, and I feel good helping that cause. And that's vastly different than the way we would have been managed 30 or 40 years ago, where, okay, well, I come in every day and I do a service, but my purpose really is generally to make someone money. I mean, I make myself money, but I'm here for a job, but they're different alignments. And so when you have all those three things, if you're able to provide someone autonomy, mastery, and purpose, what ends up happening is they just are more engaged, which means they think more about what they're doing, which means their subconscious, while they're walking down the street, is processing the day and suggesting new ideas and new ways that we solve things. And they're happier. But there is a problem. If we can't provide all three, we end up with this weird world, and that's a world we sometimes live in today. And if we are only to have autonomy and mastery, we end up building things that are irrelevant, because we don't have a purpose to why we're building them, so we feel futile, we don't get as engaged. If we only have some purpose of why we're building it, and okay, I'm self-directed in some capacity, then we actually end up with things that tend to be mediocre, like our products just aren't that great. And if we have purpose and mastery but no autonomy, it just ends up being super frustrated, because it's difficult to get anything done, right? Like, I don't know how many times, like, when I graduated university, the number one thing I didn't want was my life to be a Dilbert comic, so it's been sort of like a very passionate thing. But that's what is, like, the pointy-haired boss is the perfect embodiment of that sentiment of frustration, where I don't have the ability to make my own decisions, but I understand what's going on, and I'm really good at my job, but I can't actually get anything done, so we just end up in futility. So that's the challenge, is how do we provide all three? And so Daniel Pink has a good quote, and I'll use it. Control leads to compliance, and autonomy leads to engagement, and that's the fundamental of what I think this all comes down to, and he's already encapsulated the idea really well. So what do we do? So once again, so we understand a little bit. We understand sort of what are those fundamental things we have to provide in employees on an individual level, people on my team on an individual level. But what it really does is it requires us to change how we organize and operate drastically. And this is a scary change, and firms that have done the change are more productive. If you read into how Google operates or how Facebook operates, and they are the leaders, or Amazon operates in many capacities inside AWS, other parts of the company, there's mixed results. But if you look into those things, it's because they've rearranged and reorganized, and they are providing their employees these three benefits, these three key ingredients. So in order to understand how we organize and operate, we have to understand that teams are the Lego block to this entire world. And like if you were to think of, like if an EC2 container or a servlet or a Docker container is sort of like this thing you can stamp out, a team is like the concept in an organizational sense of how do I scale my organization? So, and they're really our functional unit of production. So like a team results in a product in some capacity. And that's why we'll focus on how do we make teams productive and how do we ensure that teams can enable members of that team to be happy and productive with autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So the reason that they are is that, one, they allow us to scale up. So we can like get more done. So if I need to build something into the limited capacity that my code base and my dependency tree allows, if I need to go build a new product, per se, I can build a team to go do that. They're really good because teams are also good because you also have the ability to evaluate ideas. So if you have just one lone person out building something, generally what happens is if they're not continually being engaged by someone else or they are going out and talking to customers or something, you just end up not having the right idea. You don't have that product market fit, and you end up wasting time. So they're actually really great for discussion and building quality ideas because you have that back and forth discussion about like, is this a good idea objectively? Is like implementing this feature the right way? So that's sort of fundamental. And then finally, they allow us to create redundancy to solve the hit by the bus syndrome, or like, you know, the reality is that we all pass through our jobs. We switch jobs and lives change, and that's okay. And in fact, the way we're moving is that people will be switching jobs more often, just due to the way that, you know, the world's changing. So the question is, you know, how can we make teams more productive? And the way to do that is, number one, is to localize authority and responsibility. And that's kind of, and what this actually means is we're redefining what a manager's job is, first of all. A manager's job changes drastically, and the other thing is you actually need less of them. You don't need as many. So a manager's job becomes focusing on defining vision and direction, and you have teams that have functional areas of work, and they own the knowledge, and they get the authority to act, and they get the responsibility, and sort of the leader or manager's job, the person that someone has to report to someone, and unless you're like using a holistic approach, holacracy is actually what I meant. Someone has to hold accountable. So how do we enable this, right? So how do we enable teams to have, you know, authority and responsibility without like losing the ship or causing more problems? And so the way we do that is, one, a team has to be provided a clear vision, right? So what is our responsibility? Is our responsibility to continuously deliver like an image processing API? No, maybe it is, but there has to be some, how does that function fill up to like where we're trying to go, right? So if the company has a purpose to organize the world's information or to make it really awesome to view images, how am I contributing to that vision? And how does that trickle down? So that's really important. And it has to be a clear area of ownership. And it has to be directly accountable to the customer in some fashion. So for instance, if you have an operations team, they're directly attributable to the customer in that they provide a stable platform for everyone else to operate on, right? And it has to be critical delivering quality or delivering your service or whatever it is to your customer. And that's made very clear. So you don't end up with teams that are just building, you know, off in the silos, building like abstract things that don't directly derive value. And the next thing is you need to have really defined interfaces. So if you have an API team and a mobile team, what is the I mean, the interface there is pretty clear. Someone builds an API, and the mobile team probably consumes the API. But you have to have that defined, and defined as a part of the mandate, just as if you would define, a class inside your code base. They all have defined areas, and they all have a single responsibility generally, if it's organized properly. And their roles are very clear. And so that's very important. And third is, when we define teams and what they're responsible for, and how much depth we give them, we need to ensure that they're actually able to be autonomous. And what I mean by that is, we can't provide employees autonomy to go do what they want, to go be self-directed if the team can't do that. And we do that by ensuring that the team is capable of delivering without being dependent. And what this really means is the team can own their own destiny, right? So I'm not stuck waiting on X all the time because they're busy off doing something else because they have different priorities. And so that's where the difficulty of this is basically it comes down to how do you properly define these responsibility areas so that teams can act autonomously. They have a clear vision, and there's a very well-defined interface between that team and all the other teams and how they're operating. So third is, and so the next thing is a part of localizing authority and responsibility and really enabling autonomy, which is what this really is about. What happens to the manager? What is their job? So their job becomes articulating, disseminating, and contextualizing vision. So what I mean is, if a company is making a change, so if we're making a drastic change, let's say we're going to do X, the manager's job is to lead, and they lead by articulating, telling them, this is what we're off to do. They're leading the troops. We're off to go conquer the world, and this is how we're going to do it, and this is what this means for everybody else. And let's have a discussion about what that means for you. Because someone has to feel how they contribute to it. They also have to understand how they contribute to it. Another really important one is guiding direction. So the easiest way you can remove someone's ability to act is simply by being a manager or a leader, someone that's responsible, some authority figure in an organization, and by going into a room and saying, no, we shouldn't do this because what your idea is bad. That's the absolute worst thing you can ever do. And the reason for that is the minute you do that, you actually, not only do you destroy an individual or team self-confidence, and that's a really bad thing to do, so that's just bad for morale, but two is that you actually remove their ability to act autonomously. You remove their autonomy. They don't have it anymore because you just said it's a bad idea. So as a manager, or a leader, it doesn't even matter if you manage people. As a senior person with some level of authority in an organization, your job becomes figuring out how to best ask guiding questions to lead the person in the right direction. And that's actually a really hard skill. And finally, you're looking at measuring results and just not worrying about the rest of it, right? It's the outcomes. And what are your outcomes you're looking for? And that generally comes down to key metrics, 99.99% uptime, 20% product growth, 20% year over year user growth, or whatever it is, some metrics. And you become a cheerleader effectively, because your job is to provide support and direction and set precedents and shape culture. And that last one's really important because shaping culture is what enables all of this to work. So, and I'll talk more about that in greater depth in a little bit. But what this really does, as I said, this enables a team to have autonomy and operate with purpose while the manager or whoever the authority person is holds the team accountable to their outcomes. So what are you saying you're going to do today? Oh, that? Okay, well, okay, that's great. Or not today, and it wouldn't be on a today level, but what are you trying to do this quarter or this year or this month or this week? Or what's this outcome of this project? And all the other stuff just sort of dwindles away. So, and another thing that enables us to actually have these autonomous team that operates self-direction is by embracing transparency, and this is a hard lesson I learned. Because transparency is really important, first of all, for one reason, is that it enables asynchronicity, right? If I can go to GitHub, and I can see, or I can go to Google Docs, or I know there's one central location, I can go get all of the reasons for why a decision was made, I don't need to be in the meeting. If I can go into my Slack channel, and that in the contents of what we discussed is written someplace, I don't need to be a part of that discussion. I just need to read your reasoning and be like, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So that ends up. We need less people in meetings. And that's really important because we don't need people to be in the meeting to understand what's decided as safety watchdogs, right? So that's really important, is embracing transparency. And this is one of the key ingredients to enabling autonomy, mastering purpose, is that you have to have free-flowing information throughout your organization that everyone can access, and it has to be organized properly. So I know where to go. What's the API team up to today? What is the operations team trying to accomplish this quarter? Like, what's their main goal? Are they trying to give us continuous delivery pipeline with Docker? Like, are we switching to Docker? Like, what are they doing and why are they doing? And if we're not doing that, what are they doing and why is that important? And that has to be readily accessible to everybody. And this is something that I have not found, in the places I've worked and people I've talked to, no one has really figured this out well yet, but we're starting to get there. And I think it's really a tooling issue. So things like Slack are really helping solve this problem. So the other thing is clear objectives, and I talked about that a little bit, but it has to be very clear what someone's trying to accomplish, and that has to be written down someplace. And I've seen some companies do this with, like, I know Salesforce does this with like a V2 mom thing. Salesforce has not adopted all these things. We're a big behemoth. But we're working towards that. And finally, we need to be open and embrace failure. If you're going to give someone autonomy, you can't, to make it be self-directed, the minute that they fail, you can't just be like, well, you failed, goodbye, or you failed, we can't do this anymore. You have to sort of just accept it's going to happen. We're going to screw up, and that's okay. And the way to approach it is as a learning experience, and not as oh, we just suck. We shouldn't do this anymore. This is a mistake. And the other thing that all of this helps, and that's actually another job of the leader or manager. Is like, so okay, we failed. That sucks. But what did we learn? How are we going to improve later so it doesn't happen again? And all of this helps with redundancy. Right? So when someone leaves, because that does happen, the flow of people between organizations will only increase. You'll leave more companies and join other companies. I mean, right now in IT, the mean time in a company is somewhere between 2 to 3 years. If you're at 5 years, you're actually in like the top quartile of people who stay at a company. That's like not normal anymore. So it's really important that we have things written down because we move quickly, and the knowledge that you move with, because we're knowledge workers, and what we understand helps us inform the decisions we make and understand the context of why we're doing it and why things were done. Having that written down someplace is really important. Okay, so the second sort of high-level theme would be to break down functional silos. And what I really mean by this is, what we've done is we've defined teams with like very clear areas of responsibility, ideally, that enable them to act autonomously, give them some purpose, and that's great. And so now the next question is like, how do you give someone mastery? Like, how do you even do that? Like, how do you ensure that you are giving your employees, or as a person of an organization, a person of a team, how can I ensure that I feel engaged and feel like I'm always learning? And that's actually a really hard problem that I don't think I personally have quite figured out all the ingredients, but I'm starting to get a picture. And I'll share that with you. And what it really means is, initially it means to break down the functional silos of QA, dev, and performance engineering. Those are actually just components of building good technology, right? Like if I'm going to build a piece of code, the fact that it has tests and it's performant is something that, as a developer, should be my primary concern, right? And those shouldn't be split off as separate things. So that's one thing, and that's a generalist move that's happening. And as I was saying, I think that this conference kind of embodies it a little bit. That's the thing that's been happening in technology, is that these functional silos are breaking down because we're more productive that way. So next thing is, how do we break down these silos? And number one is we build platforms. So if you go look at a large company at scale, so if I'm greater than, let's say, 25 engineers, this is where this starts to happen, right? The way for us to continue scaling and still be productive is by having teams that build platforms that other teams leverage. And that's actually really good. And we generally share a whole bunch of shared components. So like we'll use the same Git host, and we'll use whatever the same SCM host, and probably have the same issue management. We might use the same CI technology. But we build platforms. So for instance, your operations teams will build a deploy pipeline that has monitoring built into it and all these great things. And what their contract is that we're going to allow teams to deploy to production, when they want, whenever they want. And when it's in there, we're going to ensure that if their process dies, it gets restarted, and there's alerting available to them, and they can define monitoring. That's what our job is. We build that as a platform, and someone uses it. And that's done in lots of different ways. And I mean, that's what the DevOps role really has become. That's what sort of the movement has started to define, is how do we build that layer. And that's where technologies like Docker and other things, misos are starting to allow us to build these like incredible sort of platforms in their companies. And one thing to remember is that the way you organize people directly reflects the way your software is built. Because this, if you harken back to, like, if you think back to, like, okay, if we accept that the result, software is a team sport, if we accept that, then the way we organize those people directly reflects the way that our code shows up. And if it doesn't work that way, then we have some real communication problems in our organization, the way that we work together. And this simply is that you will work, and your team will have a defined area of focus, and you will try to optimize to be as productive as possible. Like, everyone self-optimizes to be productive, so I'll organize my code in a way that makes sense so that we actually create interfaces, don't really just trying to create interfaces, they just sort of happen. So that's something really important to remember, is that the way we organize generally will reflect the way our code looks. And another way that this is happening for us to build platforms, this is an interesting one. I'd like to watch to see the outcome. But things like React and React Native are actually starting to even break down barriers between mobile and web development. Like, if I'm a front-end web developer, I can start sharing assets, start sharing code with people who are writing code on mobile, and that's really, really powerful. Because there could be a future where there aren't specific mobile developers, because if you think about what mobile is generally, it's a mobile app talks to a backend someplace to get data, and then it displays it, and it does that in an optimized fashion for mobile. But there's on a high theoretical level, there's not much difference between that and web development. So technology will come and help us be more productive in those areas, and one of those areas is React and React Native, and I think that's actually really exciting, because it means that as a developer, as an engineer, I'm not restricted by my lack of knowledge in one area. There's technology out there that help me get to diffuse myself across, and that's one of the things that helps us build mastery, right? I can go and build a mobile web app, use React Native and React, share code, and I'm way more productive, and it helps tear down barriers, and that's really, really important. So that's great. So you build platforms. What about those times where we have to, like, work together and deliver a big project, because it kind of spans across all of our platforms? And a great example of that is, like, okay, we're an analytics company, we need to build a new data pipeline, but the operations platform doesn't support the amount of data we need to deal with, so what do we do? And then, well, we can't just wait for them, and we need them to understand our requirements. And so the way that I've been successful at doing with that problem, and I'll speak from my experience, is to build cross-layer project teams. And the idea is that this shouldn't be an everyday occurrence. This should happen only occasionally, because ideally you're structuring responsibility inside your organization in a way that teams don't have to really interact on a daily basis, right? They can focus on their job, and then when they do need to interact, it's like it's very clear dependency, very clear interface of where this responsibility lies. And when it's not, you can solve that problem sort of, because it's never going to be perfect, because we're people and it's a hard problem to solve. Is we can build sort of cross-layer project teams, and this is a team that's like, okay, we need to deliver this thing, but we need to have all this requirements gathering. So someone from the mobile and front-end team, go talk with the people that build, like, the data pipeline services, and form a project team with someone from operations, and we're going to go focus on this for 2 months and deliver it. And that has been actually very successful for me. And another thing that's actually beneficial from doing this, and the idea is that these teams don't last. They last for the duration of the project, then you sort of go back. You go back to what you were doing until the next thing. And one of the other great benefits of this is that this really helps with cross-pollinating knowledge between the different sort of platforms and different teams that you're using. Cool. All right, so one of the benefits of functional silos, and one of the arguments I've heard of, like, hey, we should keep working the way we work, is that you end up with just de facto checks built into your system. Like, if you have a QA person, there's someone that's going to say this needs to be QA'd, right? Like, that's what they think about, because that's sort of like the defined role they have. Or has this been perf tested, for instance? However, the problem is that the problem with the functional thing is it makes it hard for us to, like, make changes quickly, and we're in an ever-evolving world where the pace of innovation is always increasing, so we can't really afford that anymore, right? In order for us to be one of those top firms, we have to be able to make changes quickly and get stuff out the door quickly and learn and come back to the world and understand, okay, this is what we need to do. So we need to be able to roll out code quickly and not have a lot of meetings and just try stuff out, because that's sort of like what we figured out is the best way to get stuff done. And I mean, that's really just an application of the scientific method. Therefore, we have to do away with specialization, really, on a certain level. You'll always have specialization, but you'll have less and less people inside an organization that are, I'm a MySQL server admin, right? Like that role will sort of goes away as these things continue to become more abstracted. You don't need 7 of them because you probably won't have 7 MySQL databases in your organization anymore, instances running with different people doing queries. You probably need 1 of them because there's a team that wraps an API layer around MySQL, and they build software that makes it super easy for you to spin up a MySQL instance and optimize it. And there's one person that is responsible for, like, how do we do that in a generic fashion? So specialization eventually just goes away because we just don't need as many people who are super specialized anymore. We need more generalists. We need to be more applied. I need to be able to dive into anything. So one of the ways we do that is that we define and focus on development flow. And what I mean by this is, like, we need a pipeline that everyone can use as an understanding of how we take something from, like, idea phase to production. What's that look like? And this is just an example one. So, like, how does something get to a roadmap? Like, how do we decide that's going to be a thing we're going to do? How does it go from the roadmap to the backlog? And how does it go from the backlog to development and to production? And this is not a strange new concept. It's just lots of organizations don't actually define what this looks like. It's sort of like just this emergent process. We'll have a meeting because we thought about this new thing we need to work on, and that's great. But it's not solidified in a structure. And the reason you want to solidify this in a structure that everyone understands is because it actually gives rails for all of us to operate on. Like, I can become a generalist, and I can work on lots of different things, and I can expand what I've worked on, and I can gain new knowledge because there's this, like, one way that we all take things from ideation to the time it gets deployed. And there's, like, a philosophy, and this is where culture comes in. And one of the sort of, like, impacted or sort of structured components of your development culture is, like, how do you actually develop? And that's what this really is. It's just a directed graph of how things move from ideations, from, like, how do we go from we want to do this, we want to think about this, to, like, okay, we're doing this, oh, we're going to try it this way, oh, that didn't work, we're going to try it again this way, that didn't work, okay, we're done, we're happy with it, it's now released to everybody, right? So that's really important. And this gives us a common language to operate on. So that's great, but how in the world do you actually, like, make that possible? And the tools are starting to be out there. And the way you make this possible, make this really easy for anyone to go and do something like this, is that you just leverage automation. Automation is a rule of the law. And the reason we do this, number one, we want to automate things, is it just makes everything faster and more efficient. Because we can codify processes inside our automation. So one of the ways to do that is, let's say you have, for a very trivial example, but this is important in certain situations, let's say you have, like, all of our branches in Git need to be named a certain way so that we can tie that branch back to, like, an issue that someone's working on, right? So a way you can have that codified as part of your development flow is in CI, don't let the build pass if it doesn't match your naming scheme, right? Like, that's an example of how you can take these processes, things that you have to think about, and just automating them. So, like, humans were like, we're just like, oh, I named it wrong. Okay, let me switch it. And that's great because they don't have to tell you about it anymore. It just happens. And when you screw up, because we're just humans, we all make mistakes. And I think software development is the greatest example of how humans, we're very creative. We're very bad at doing things repetitively. Like, we're terrible at it. We're not computers. We're good at being creative. We're very bad at repetitive processes. And that's where this development pipeline and codifying it with automation is very important. So that's great. CI is great. So it's automation of, like, how do we get things, how do we test, and that's where continuous integration services come in. How do we get it deployed, and how do we ensure that there's monitoring? Automation of all those things enable you to have that end-to-end sort of, like, codified process. And as I said, humans are not computers. We're creative, so we need to let computers do all the manual process stuff that just makes our jobs really terrible, right? And so that's another way you can provide more mastery, because you can provide someone more time to actually think about hard problems and how to build better products and solve problems instead of dealing with process because you've let a computer tell you when you screwed up the process. And that's really important. So finally, like, another thing that It sort of helps us break down these functional silos and therefore enables us to have mastery. Like I can learn more things. I can learn more parts of the problem. I can get better at X. Is to build in knowledge dissemination as a part of your development flow. And so this is just a diagram that I built a long time ago. But what I'm trying to relay here is that every part of the process, every part of like taking something from ideation to like production, there is like decisions that are made, right? And there's reasoning behind those decisions. Like, well, why did you put the button over there? Well, it's because 75% of users actually looked there first, and that just made it like in A/B testing, it just turned out to be the best way to do it. But where was that recorded? Like, how can I build on that knowledge? It's stuck in your head and maybe someone else's head, but where is that like locked down? And maybe that's a trivial example, but what about an example of like, how does our deployment pipeline work, right? Or why did we choose to not write tests for this one factor? So building in knowledge dissemination, like how do you take my understanding of why I made these decisions and allow other people to consume that information and are organized in a fashion that makes sense to them is really important. Because it means that, oh, I need to go fix a bug in this system, oh, but there's all this documentation, or there's some way for me to understand like what is standard operating procedure, what is, why were the decisions made to get it to this state? Why does the system work this way? Is it just like, did we rush, or were there actual reasons behind it? And this provides us context and allows us to be masters. So I can jump between ships or teams if I need to, or whatever it is I need to do. And the other reason to do this is that it actually enables autonomy, because I don't need to go talk to X, Y, or B to understand like what I should be doing. I can go read it, and then I can think about it and like, okay, I think this is X. I think we should do X. You can write it in a GitHub issue or write it wherever you want to put it. Talk to them via Slack. But you don't have to do that full like hour-long sync up of like how does this even work? So that is really important. And I found there's a couple of strategies that do this very well. One is when decisions are made, make sure they get back into your issue management. So right, if you go into a meeting or you hop on a Hangout, you have a Slack conversation, hey, we decided to do it this way, make sure that's like recorded someplace and not just in Slack. Because Slack is a great tool, but its searching experience is still just terrible. And I don't know what to search for. Two is have a system of lunch and learns. Like, this is actually something that was super successful. It's a part of building stuff for my teams. They would always, at the end of it, it was actually kind of like, this is awesome. It was a great way for people to show off what they did and help them feel like rewarded. But also disseminate understanding is, if I went and me and some other people went and built a system, we would present, like, how does the system work and why did we make those decisions? So that has been very successful for me, so that's another way to do it. But what's really important is that you've actually thought about like how do people get understanding of the system? Because at the end of the day, we're just humans, and what we understand and know, it helps define the decisions that we make, and the decisions that we make help define the products we build, right? All right. So duplication's okay, and it's not the primary concern. So this is something, this only really starts to matter at scale. So when you get into like, let's say 500 or 100 engineers, right? As developers, we have this focus on trying to build a perfect code base, right? Like, I have it. Like, I want my code to be absolutely beautiful, the best abstractions thoughtful, anyone able to read it, and those are all really good things. And we try to have one way of doing things, but one thing that's common, if you look at organizational structures in technology, is that we organize ourselves around ways to ensure that we don't have more than one of things. So you end up with architects. You end up with all the decisions happening to flow and get sign-off. And this, once again, is a great example of how you can remove autonomy, because you're not allowing someone to make the decision. Like, a part of your culture should be like, hey, we should make sure we have less, one of one thing. And if you don't want to use the thing that we're using, you have to have a really good reason why you're not using it. But that should be a part of your culture, and that's like a culture problem, not like an organizational problem. So, build a culture of eventual alignment and executing on your vision. And a great example of this is Facebook has 3 mobile UI frameworks. I mean, the teams just choose which ones they want to use, and some of them write their own. And they all have really good reasons for it, because not every single problem is the same, and the problems and the people on the team are not the same. And as we know, Software development's a team sport. So trying to control these things is futile. Like, it's very frustrating. Like, as a manager, you sit back and you're like, well, this is very frustrating because we're actually not focusing on solving the problem. We're focused on these code-based issues, and those are important, but like they're not as important as actually delivering something. And we can focus on like eventual consistency, have those conversations over a long time, because most of the time, we don't understand the problem in the first place, right? We have to go build something to understand it before we can decide, like, is this the right fit? So, and finally, and this one is actually, this one's really important, is focusing on team dynamics, and I only have one slide on it, and I'll talk about it quickly. But research has shown, and this is very interesting, and research has shown that teams that have a well-connected communication graph, so that's like if we have 3 people in a team and we all talk to each other equivalently, you actually are more productive. And that's really interesting. And this is where like that rock star mentality, where you have that like one person who is like probably an asshole, but they're just really smart and they just like get stuff done, but they're the worst thing you can do, because what ends up happening is that everybody just talks to that guy, and he actually removes people's ability to be autonomous. He removes people's ability to have, or she, to have mastery. And you just end up with someone that like they're not very rewarded, because you have somebody that just comes in and changes the metrics, sort of changes the communication graph. And this happens almost unknowingly. And as a manager and as someone who's seen the way teams interact, this has been like the #1 thing. Like if I get someone in my organization that is that mentality of like, I know best, I have ego, and they have some confirmation bias because they have delivered some things, and they start getting authority because of that, it actually is incredibly poisonous. It's the most poisonous thing you can do. You're better off just firing them, because everyone else will end up being more productive anyways, or moving them to a different organization, like 100%. Netflix, great point of Netflix, or Facebook actually. Let's go with Facebook first. Facebook has, they have like a boot camp program. And the purpose of the boot camp program really is to find out who are you, so we can decide if you're good for a culture, and if not, here's your severance, bye. Right? Like, that's great. But the reason they do that is because of science. Like, we know that if everyone communicates equivalently, if everyone feels as if they're all equal parts of the team, then we build better products, because we can ensure that everyone feels if they have their own ability to be self-directed, they have their own ability to be to have mastery, like they have things to learn. I'm not always going to X because X knows. I'm going to go figure out what it should be. I'm going to talk to people about it. But X has strong opinions, and she or he says, you do X because this is the way you should do it. And another example is Netflix. Netflix, like if you're poisonous to the culture, they have no problem. Like Netflix is one of the companies that has sort of taken hold of this idea that if you're poisonous to our culture, or if you don't if you don't fit nicely in the organization anymore, we're just going to give you a severance package and you go find a new job. And the reason they do this is because, versus general like corporate understanding is like, if this person has created value in the past, we want to keep them because they might create value in the future. But that actually axiom doesn't hold true. Like just because you created value previously doesn't mean that you fit the organization as it grows, or like where you need to go, or maybe you have kept baggage or whatever it is. So that's changing, and it's because this strongly connected graph of how we communicate is really important. And that's why tools like Slack, if you look at this, are actually like very popular, because it's a really easy way for like a small team of 3 to 5, which is roughly where we should keep team sizes, communicating and have everyone communicating equivalently. So that's really important. So this is where I say, it's like the death of the rock star mentality, and it really does have to happen, because ego has a huge bearing on the way like people interact. Like if you talk to someone with a big ego, it's not very fun. Like it's not enjoyable. It's not great when you walk into a room and you're trying to make a decision made, and some guy or someone walks in the room and says, "Hey, you all suck." Like that sucks. That's not fun. So just keep those things in mind. And the final point I'll say on team dynamics is that what this means for us, for anyone trying to have job growth, is that the core skills you need to be, let's say you want to be an architect, you want to have authority. Like I want to be an individual contributor, I don't want to be a manager, but your skill set is the same skill set you need effectively at the end of the day as being a manager. Take Joe or Jenny, and they have this idea, and the idea is good, but I don't want to come in and I don't want to like impact their thought process. I just want to help guide them in the right direction. And it's surprising, especially in technology, we're not very good at this. We're actually really bad at it. We're like terrible at it, honestly. And so the skill set you need, that we're going to need, is especially to go up in the organization and gain more authority, because that's sort of like what's for societies decide the success. It depends on your interpretation of success, but society's general understanding of like how you get more money and become more successful is that you have more authority and that you get paid more because you have to make bigger decisions. And that's going to change just because of all these things that are happening, because of how we enable knowledge workers to be more productive. Is that you will need to understand how to provide guidance and not walk in the room and destroys people's autonomy, and enable them to become masters, enable them to be self-directed. And that's like a crucial skill set that I definitely haven't mastered, but effectively comes down to asking probing questions and having really good debate. And if you have someone in your organization that doesn't enable you to have good debate, like they walk into a room, they're not like objective, they're not able to objectively step back from the idea and just like probe at and figure out if it's right, then you actually are going to build worse products, like at the end of the day. So to wrap this up, because I'm drastically running out of time, it's a race. What we have right now is we're in a race. Technology and knowledge worker in general, especially technology, just because of our rapid pace of change and how quickly we can change things. We don't have the physical world stopping us. It means that we're at sort of this race to become more productive, and that the pace of innovation is only increasing, and that's very well evidently shown in this graph. So companies who adapt will remain competitive or become leaders in their space. So if you can enable your employees or people in your organization to have autonomy, mastery, and purpose, you will be more productive, and you will be competitive because you'll have better ideas, and you'll be able to do things faster. And one of the things is that the larger a company is, the harder it is to change, because this is fundamentally a people and technology problem, right? So existing organizations, I don't want to throw anyone out there, but think of like your favorite 5,000 person technology organization that probably produces a legacy database system. They're not going to be able to adapt, because the people inside that organization, the way they operate and the way they think, it's a culture issue. And changing culture is really, really hard. Because you have to change people's attitudes, you have to change how people interact, and you have to change how people prioritize. And that's like the hardest problem. Like if changing software is difficult, changing the way people interact is by far more difficult. And this is actually exciting, because what this does is it's going to create incredible opportunities for disruption. Both companies, because other companies won't be able to compete at the same rate, and for opportunities for individuals, right? So I have the skill set to make teams work better together. I know it doesn't matter if I'm a manager or not. If I create more net value, because I have a better way of discussing these things, I know how to get people to talk, how to produce ideas, you're going to be way more valuable, and you're going to help transform these companies. So that's really important. And to finish this off, I was looking for quotes, and I found this one from Benjamin Franklin. I thought it was great. The embodiment of technology, and the reason that this is so evident is that changing stuff is much easier, like the cost of change is so much lower, is that when you're finished changing, you're finished. So companies that don't innovate, you're done. And the slower you are at actually like making changes, like getting stuff done, impacts your ability to be profitable in the long run. And so that's the end of the show. So thank you very much.